Dr. Singh.
Thank you all so very much for your patience as I traveled hurriedly from across the Bay. I came to a new appreciation for all of the many individuals in the Bay Area who slog through traffic every day to get to work and do their yeoman's work every day. So kudos to everyone who commutes. It's quite a task. We live in a very special part of the world, don't we? Very busy and populated. But my focus today isn't going to be on traffic. Let's talk about something else. I'm going to talk about the building the science of resilience, because I think this is a very important topic to gain insights on how we can not just identify symptoms that might affect individuals early in life, but how can we change the trajectory of symptoms from lasting a lifetime. So these are my sources of funding that support. Most of the work that I will present to you today is funded by the National Institute of Health, among other private foundations and industry. I do consult for some Silicon Valley companies as well as Synovian Pharmaceuticals, but none of the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today is associated with that effort. And then we recently just published a book, a clinical handbook, for the diagnosis and treatment of mood disorders in kids. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little while. So let's talk about the overview of what we're going to share together today. We'll have a conversation, I hope, where we can kind of just understand what mood disorders are and that they can run in families, they commonly begin in childhood, and potentially can last a lifetime. Early signs of problems with moody moods, reflect a change in brain function. No longer do we believe that, that psychiatric symptoms or mood problems are related to a chemical imbalance or because it's something that somebody did wrong. There's a very clear understanding now that mood symptoms present for a variety of reasons that are very complicated and can be impacted by a host and a network of regions in the brain. We also want to convey the point that addressing mood problems early may protect individuals from having persistent symptoms throughout their lives. And I want to end today's discussion by sharing some very exciting, hot off the press data that we are just about to publish in a major science journal that gives, in my view, the best story of hope out there for the prevention of mood problems in kids. So why are we talking about this today? This is important for a number of reasons. We are all sensitive to environmental influences that may increase risk for mood problems, and I'll talk about what those mood disorders look like in a minute. When mood disorders start early in life, they can have serious developmental and health consequences. So in other words, your brain and your body can be affected by these symptoms. Mood problems can run in families, and diagnosing mood disorders is challenging because there are no blood tests, there's no diagnostic test, there isn't a gene or a single brain scan that can help me diagnose somebody with a mood disorder. And because of that, we struggle in our day-to-day interactions, not just sharing the experience of struggling with mood symptoms, but also validating them with a scientific basis behind them. So at Stanford, there are a number of investigators, including myself, that are very passionate about trying to understand the science of mood problems early in life so that we can do a better job of preventing them. And knowing risk factors and early warning signs can actually help identify and treat individuals who need it the most. Because the principle is, if you can predict it, you can prevent it. If you can predict it, you can prevent it. So much of what we do and much of the service that I think the WHO family is trying to convey here today with you tonight is the importance of education and destigmatizing these symptoms so we can begin to have conversations that allow us to predict it so we can prevent it. We need 3 key breakthroughs to improve mental health in all of us. We need better treatments for people living with symptoms that predict and track outcomes. A lot of our work in science has been focused on trying to find the next best treatment. And we're struggling because there are so many people suffering from these symptoms that cause disability. In fact, did you know that depression is the leading cause of global health burden today? It's the leading cause of global health burden. And we've barely made a scratch in trying to address this global problem. It doesn't see creed, it doesn't see race, it doesn't see socioeconomic status. It is a worldwide problem. So we have our work cut out for us to do a better job of finding the best treatments for those in need who already are experiencing these symptoms, because fundamentally we don't have anything great for anything bad. So the most severe cases are the ones that are struggling the most and often have tried 5 or 10 or 15 or many treatments without success. Those are the kinds of families that we aspire to treat and help, because we don't want them to continue the suffering that they've already experienced. But sometimes people will say, well, then it's too late. You've done what you can and you do the best you can by trying to minimize the burden of illness. But I would argue that we have more work to do also in the space of preventing mood disorders from sinking in and becoming and taking hold of someone's life. And we can do that through preventive interventions for those at risk or in pre-symptomatic stages. And that's most commonly true in childhood and adolescence. That's usually when those habits and those symptoms have early signs or warnings that can be caught. And guess what? The brain changes. So a lot of kids that come into my office to see me as a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Stanford are looking for that hope. And it's my obligation to provide that hope, because I can't look into a crystal ball and know what's going to happen to every kid that comes through my office, but I can definitely say that things will change, because that's just a function of the brain growing, right? So we have an opportunity to work in this preemptive space and make a difference. And then finally, we need biomarkers for early detection. We need to be able to find that diagnostic test. We need to be able to find clues in the biology of individuals so that we can match the person to the right treatment. The personalized medicine piece is very important, and there are many people in our institution that are working on the personalized mental health story as well. So I'm looking forward to sharing more with you in the future, because I think we have so many exciting things that are happening in this space. And guess what? We also have lots of people interested in this when we never did before. We have lots of tech companies in the area. We have a lot of intellectual resources in our community here in the Bay Area to be able to leverage that in a way that helps us make a difference in this space. So how common is depression in kids? People didn't think that depression existed in kids before probably 2 decades ago. They thought it was primarily an adult condition. And when do you ever hear a kid say, I'm depressed, I'm melancholic? Not very often. But a kid might say, I'm cranky, or I'm finding myself not liking the things that are fun for me anymore, and I stopped doing the things that are fun for me. We have to understand what the language of depression looks like in kids, and so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too. But here are some statistics to give you an idea that about 1/5 of kids will experience a major depressive episode before they reach adulthood. So childhood and adolescence is a common age of onset for major mood disorders. Some have depressive symptoms any given time. 10 to 15% of kids express depressive symptoms. 5% may have a major depressive episode. 2% may describe feeling kind of low for persistent years at a time. And that's also sad to imagine that kids can live with low-level, low moods for years on end before it is realized as a problem. And maybe that's our culture and our society. We socialize around, oh, he'll grow out of it, or she'll find a way to see joy in other things, or this is just a phase. And yes, I did say that the brain can change, but sometimes symptoms stick around. And that's when we have to wonder together whether there are other things to consider and potentially the value of intervening, even just with talk therapy. You'd be amazed what we can do, not only to change behavior, but also to change the brain and change the outcome. So I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment. And, the recurrences are an important piece to mention too, that depression oftentimes isn't just a one and done deal. Say, for example, there's a major stressor that's occurred and you find yourself feeling in a low mood related to that major stressor. Sometimes those sad feelings linger for a while. Sometimes they go away, sometimes they come back. And it's in the coming back that we want to be most helpful and instrumental in predicting and preventing. So what are the mood disorders that are out there? What do we know? What's the language that we use in our field to communicate? In kids, there are several diagnoses and groups of diagnoses that constitute pediatric mood disorders in kids. One of them is major depression or major depressive disorder. Previously, we used to call sort of that low level of depression dysthymia. Now it's called persistent depressive disorder. And then there's a class of or category of depressive symptoms that don't really quite meet the criteria for either of those conditions that we think of like as a kind of a sub-threshold or unspecified form of depression. Another cluster of mood disorders in kids are the bipolar disorders. The bipolar spectrum disorders can include bipolar 1, 2, or unspecified forms. Again, a subthreshold form of the 1 and 2. And 1 and 2 are usually defined by specific length of criteria. So if you have bipolar 1 disorder, you had pretty significant mania symptoms to a level where you've been hospitalized or can last 50% of the day every day for at least a week. Some people don't have a week episodes, but they cycle up and down, and that is a condition called cyclothymia. There's a new disorder that we've recently begun to think about in kids who are chronically irritable, who have sustained periods of low-level irritability that's chronic between the ages of 6 and 10, and can sometimes be punctuated by bursts of irritability. And these temper irritability outbursts aren't just, shouting, but really physically or raging for hours at a time. They're pretty impairing for kids. And so people are conceptualizing that condition as disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, although it still needs to be validated. And then finally, if kids experience life stressors and are just adjusting to those stressors, that can also constitute an adjustment disorder. And we try our best to understand the boundaries between normal adaptive growing pains or psychological adjustment to stages in development versus something that may merit more attention in therapy or treatment by a psychiatrist. And so how do we look at these warning signs, and how do we understand what crosses the threshold from normal behavior, right? All of us have good days and bad days. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture of my own kids who have their good days and bad days, and you'll see what I mean when you see these pictures. But there are some kids who just struggle to make it to school or keep friendships or struggle with academics in ways that are not just one subject here and there, but really struggle in multiple subjects or have trouble concentrating or finishing their homework or have more global learning deficits. I'm going to just describe some warning signs of how I think of both the mania spectrum and the depression spectrum symptoms present in kids. These warning signs can be helpful clues. If you're observing them in your kids, I wouldn't recommend you that just necessarily pick up the phone and call, but start the conversation and have a discussion about whether these symptoms might merit a closer look by a pediatrician or a family doctor. And if it seems like that's the first great step, and maybe more is needed, then referrals to mental health specialists can potentially be helpful. So what are the crossing the threshold signs? For mania, if a kid is taking risks that are beyond what are normative for kids take a lot of risks, and especially in adolescence, it's a time to test your independence. The risk-taking behaviors that are accompanied with false beliefs of achievement. I'm going to go and sell all my stuff so that I can go and be the next best savior, or the next, Google master, or whatever the thought of a false achievement might be. I can't think of anything creative off the top of my head right now because I'm still thinking about the traffic, but here's that. You can imagine someone saying, I'm going to jump off a high rise and I'm going to fly, right? That's another example of a risk-taking behavior with false beliefs of achievement. My body will be able to learn how to fly, I'll just grow wings. Getting only a few hours of sleep but not feeling sleepy the next day. How many of you are surprised by the numbers I put up here? Children need 8 to 10 hours of sleep, but adolescents need 10 to 12 hours of sleep. Is that surprising to you? A little bit? Mixed feelings about it? Some people think, oh yeah, we know this, but my teenager never gets 10 to 12 hours of sleep. Well, your teenager probably gets more like 5 or 6 hours of sleep during the week, and then sleeps in till 2 o'clock in the afternoon over the weekend, right? And we permit that because that's catch-up sleep. And that's actually developmentally adaptive. Kids need sleep. I can't underscore this enough. This is an important cornerstone for building resilience in kids. Sneaking out of the house, running away, engaging in sexual behaviors, recreational drugs. Again, there's a threshold after which, when it becomes problematic in terms of day-to-day functioning, if it's involving recurrent use or going out of your way to engage in this behavior, then that will become noticeable and cross the threshold. Kids saying, I hear voices telling me to hurt myself. Those voices are not typical. Most kids don't experience voices inside their heads telling them to hurt themselves or hurt other people. I feel so energized. I feel like an Energizer bunny. I'm just going to run and do everything I can in a short period of time. That may feel great if you're going to Disneyland and you want to hit all of the rides within a short period of time. I get that. But this is not contextual. This is Energizer bunny, even outside of a typical context. A child that says, my brain is going 100 miles an hour. And you find in your observation of them, they're jumping from topic to topic, and it's really hard to follow their train of thought. Grades getting worse from incomplete or attempted schoolwork because the kid is so distracted by all of the other things that they want to do. And usually when a kid has a mania, they're internally distracted. In contrast to a kid with ADHD or attention deficit with hyperactivity, usually that kid is twirling, distracted by the construction rig outside. It's usually environmental, external distractors that distract a kid with ADHD. But a kid with bipolar disorder is internally distracted. It's their racing thoughts. It's the internal voice in their head that's keeping them from doing what they need to do. Behavioral problems can emerge as a result of this. Talking too much, being loud, hard to interrupt or understand. So those are warning signs of mania. How about depression? So this is the opposite pole, and I'm not 100% sure anymore that kids fall on one end of the spectrum or the other. In Stanford, we actually had a bipolar clinic and a depression clinic for kids, and then we realized that a lot of kids belonged in the opposite. And we're realizing, too, that kids change. And so now we have a pediatric mood disorders program with an appreciation that things do change over development, and the boundaries between these poles may not be as clear-cut as one extreme or the other. Sometimes mania symptoms can also overlap with depression. So warning signs for that are less interest in activities that were previously pleasurable, spending more time alone, getting only a few or too many hours of sleep. So again, reminding you what's normative for kids, but in depression you can actually see or observe insomnia as well as hypersomnia or too much sleep. expressing feelings of guilt, sadness, or low self-esteem, not just once after a bad grade or losing a friendship, but kind of persistently. Having low energy, feeling sluggish, having difficulty concentrating, failing grades, getting into trouble, not paying attention, poor or excessive appetite, and potentially somatic complaints, or my body hurts, Mom, I don't want to go to school, my tummy hurts. That's often a manifestation of depression in kids. Pacing about or appearing slow, not caring about appearance, not brushing their teeth every day, not finding themselves grooming, running away from home, again, engaging in risk-taking behaviors like substance abuse, feeling hopeless or helpless about the future, or potentially preoccupied with thoughts of death. So what happens to kids when they experience these symptoms and they persist and cross the threshold? Pediatric depression is very commonly recurrent. Usually a first episode is not very severe, and sometimes kids, before they have their major episode, will have a couple of years of those low level of mood symptoms or the persistent depressive disorder symptoms that can kind of morph into a more formulated one if it's not intervened upon. Later episodes tend to last longer, tend to be more severe, and tend to be harder to treat. In kids with bipolar disorder, most kids actually recover, but many relapse because about only a third of them actually continue to take their medications a year out. And usually the things that portend a worse outcome are things like conduct disorder, getting in trouble with the law, but certainly having an intact family can predict a better outcome. And in adolescents or older kids with bipolar disorder, nearly all recover, but many relapse. And sometimes you observe mixed episodes and rapid cycling, which can predict worse outcomes. So the more the swings, the more problematic they can be to treat. And as I mentioned, only about a third take medication as prescribed. So what are the medications people use to treat depression? Depression is FDA approved, or Food and Drug Administration approved, two agents, fluoxetine and escitalopram, or Prozac and Lexapro. That means that we still have an unmet need to approve additional options, because not one size fits all. And so some of the work that we're very motivated to support, and it's not that there isn't science to support it, but we need to get safe and effective treatments to kids and have more options for them, because so many kids, as we may discuss later on, are using treatments that aren't FDA approved. They're off-label, and that's not that that's a bad thing. It just means that we have some work to do in this space to develop more options that are approved. The landscape is a little bit richer for bipolar disorder, and this actually needs to be updated because we do actually have now 2 new drugs in bipolar depression that have just been approved, olanzapine and fluoxetine, and I'll update that when I share the slides later. And what are the psychosocial treatments that are out there? Stress management and regulating sleep is a primary first step. We talk a lot with kids who come to our clinic to work on ways to have adaptive relationships with technology, to reduce screen time, and to manage stress through coping strategies. We work on exercise, weight control, and avoiding caffeine and alcohol and drugs. The exercise piece is a really important one. If kids are never introduced to the feeling of potential lifting of mood from exercise ever in their adolescent life, they may not necessarily embed that behavior. So though organized sports can be helpful, any form of exercise is great. Get your heart rate up and appreciate how it feels, how uplifting your mood can be just by doing that. And when I presented this to an academic meeting a couple of years ago, I said, exercise works, there's lots of data to support it. People said, oh, come on, give me a break. Nobody listens to me when I tell them to exercise. And I said, well, there's some real power in sharing the science behind this, because it isn't just something that your mom says. In fact, my mom told me when I was a teenager and thought something was catastrophically wrong with me, and I said, take me to the doctor right away. She said, exercise. I said, no, take me to the doctor. What did the doctor say? Exercise. And who did I listen to? My mom or my doctor? My doctor, right. So this is very personal for me. I think that having had that experience, I feel very compelled to share that it's important for us to continue to encourage exercise. And I'll show you some data about the value of it in the next slide. There are a number of organizations out there that support the treatment and collaborative care for youth experiencing mood disorders. So I point to some of these websites and resources online. I also partner with the schools. So whoever, if you in your life you have someone, a mental health professional working with you, empower them to connect with the school and help advocate for a child who might need a different learning strategy, because it's not easy to be depressed and have to go to school all day. And the cognitive burden for that can be very tough, especially as you're trying to get through treatment. So some appreciation and compassion for that can go a long way, and a lot of schools still need additional resources to understand those unmet needs for kids. And so having a clinician and parent advocate can be super helpful to design a strategy that's least restrictive for a kid. And then there are a number of psychotherapies in kids with bipolar disorder. These listed here are multi-family psychoeducational groups, as well as family-focused therapy, which are very clearly now evidence-based. There's lots of science to support that they are effective, and sometimes in combination with medications to help treat mood symptoms. In the depression space, there's literature that suggests about 2/3 of kids respond to CBT or interpersonal therapy, so cognitive behavioral therapy or interpersonal therapy compared to a control condition. So we know these therapies work, and we should be trying to get them to kids as early as possible. So here's a story on depression. It builds reserve and improves depression. This is not just in one small study. Now we've replicated in multiple studies that we've been able to do this meta-analysis of all of the data that are out there in kids. And it's a very, very clear demonstration that exercise improves depression. Another very interesting recent publication just this past year that I thought was fun was that nature walks can actually undo the negative effects of stressful life events on depression, positive affect, and mental well-being. So I tell my kids that we live in the Bay Area and it's super expensive to live out here. We don't pay to live inside. We pay to live outside. So get your butt outside. But we do spend a lot of time outside, and there's data to support not just the well-being of a child and buffering against stressful life events, but did you know that exercise can actually, and hiking, for example, can actually improve memory? So kids have this very, goal-directed, activity to go on a hike and walk a path and learn the directionality that's associated with it. You don't even realize it, but you're using areas of your brain, and you're pruning areas of your brain that improve memory just by doing that one exercise. Promoting resilience. My daughter will say, hiking totally beats memorizing the times tables, right? So how do you promote resilience? I think it's important to understand mood symptoms and triggers, so those warning signs I described to you before, and what potentially triggers those. It could be anything. Sometimes there is a trigger, sometimes there isn't, but if you can know the trigger, again, you can predict it and then prevent it. So I like to encourage everybody to mood chart. Chart your moods, whether it's in a journal or on an app. There's tons of apps out there that are very valuable to help kids track their moods. And if you don't want to use a wearable or technology, just simply journal or make a chart, a daily chart or a weekly chart of moods, and keep track of how those moods are going, because you'll identify things that are predictable and then potentially preventable. Like, oh, the other night I only got 6 hours of sleep and I noticed that I was really cranky the next day. Have a plan to manage stress. This is supremely important, and is a lot of what is spent time doing during therapy. Maintain a healthy diet, do physical exercise, and get regular sleep. Train the brain through mindfulness. Mindfulness isn't the only way to train the brain, and I'm going to show you one strategy that we've been able to demonstrate that also trains the brain just through effective training on pro-social behaviors, communication skills, and problem solving. promote mutual respect and caring in relationships, have a healthy relationship with technology, and when needed, treatments that combine psychotherapy with biological interventions can together prevent future and worsening mood problems. So here are my kids. On any given day, they're lovely to each other. And then on the next day, they're fighting like cats and dogs. This is normal, right? Normal. But what happens when the behavior of either cycling or persistent beyond sibling rivalries, we've all been there if we've had siblings in our lives and we know what that's like. We've experienced it ourselves. So you can get a sense of what's typical versus not, or crossing the threshold just by indexing your own experiences. But we've used the family history of mood disorders as our model system to better understand risk. So we've taken families and we study families affected by mood disorders because what we've discovered is that the kids that are in families affected by mood disorders, if their parents have bipolar disorder, for example, the environment can sometimes be chaotic in the family, and that has an impact on the brain development. What we've discovered is that the more the chaos in the environment, the less connected the prefrontal cortical networks to areas of the brain that are trying to regulate emotion and reward. And so those disconnected networks become our target for treatment. We can also use the brain to provide us clues about stages of depression. Are we at that pre-symptomatic stage? Are we finally at a fully syndromal stage? We're not using brain imaging right now to help us make a diagnosis, but we certainly can now begin to imagine using the brain to help us stage illness. And that can be helpful because if we know what stage we're in, then we can appropriately match those treatments. And what we've also learned when we followed kids who have a family member, either a father or mother with depression or bipolar disorder, if we follow them out, we start by observing these kids from a stage of health. They're pretty healthy when we first evaluate them. And then we follow them for, now it's been about 7 to 8 years, on average about 3 to 5 years. And what we found were that the kids that were resilient at the follow-up seemed to have more connected networks. And those connected networks correlated with more prosocial behaviors, which we thought perhaps attributed to some of their resilience. So what is resilience? How do we define it? It seems a little elusive, doesn't it? It's a complex and dynamic process. Generally speaking, we all know and are familiar with the definition that it's the ability to adapt successfully to adversity, stressful life events, significant threat, or trauma. But it's on a continuum. It's not a fixed state. It doesn't just, you don't just get it or have it at the beginning of your life. It's something that's very dynamic and can be cultivated with the potential for change across the lifespan. So that's key. What that means is that we can actually use resilience to train people's behaviors towards better outcomes. Okay? And that, I think, is a very hopeful story. Ask yourself for a minute, what makes you resilient? What makes you resilient? Do you keep a positive attitude? How many keep a positive attitude? How many reframe their stressful thoughts? Okay, I've got to sit in this traffic, but boy, I'm so glad I'm here with Lyra and we're having fun together and we're chatting it up and time flies. How many reframe their stressful thoughts? Okay? How many develop a moral compass? I do this because I value this. This is really important to me. Okay? More hands up. How many have a resilient role model? Some folks in the audience, I have a resilient role model too. Face your fears. Just confront them head on. Let's just bring it on. You know? Develop active coping skills. I got to work on this. This is something that I know stress is normal, so I got to work on active coping skills. How about establish and nurture supportive social networks? How many of you do that? A few hands. Prioritize physical well-being. I just told you exercise is awesome. How many many of you use it as your resilience mechanism? Yeah, some folks. How many have learned the secret of how to train their brain? Anyone in the audience? A little bit more elusive, huh? Well, I'll tell you, there are very concrete things you do every day to train your brain. You just may not know it. And then another one is playing to your strengths. And how many of you play to your strengths? I know I'm really good at this. I'm just going to go back to doing that, especially when things are tough. Anybody? Some folks? So I noticed that some seemed more natural or intuitive for some folks in the audience and others less so. But I hope that these human strategies are helpful to kind of remind ourselves that these are strategies that we all know exist and are there. In fact, they're things that behavioral neuroscience has supported for eons and eons, so this is nothing new. But you would be surprised, actually, to know that even though we do have a lot of science to support that these things exist, we don't know why. We don't know why they make us resilient. So that's what my focus is at Stanford, is to really understand why is it that these strategies are so effective. I'm going to focus a little bit for the next couple of slides on training your brain and establishing and nurturing a supportive social network. On the basis of the slide that I showed you previously, that pro-social behaviors seem to be lead to more adaptive outcomes. Because the idea and vision behind this is if we can cultivate pro-social behaviors to change the brain and then change the outcome. The idea being, can we cultivate the capacity to make and sustain friendships, to have empathy for others, to have compassion and to be supportive of other people and to effectively communicate. So what do? We had kids come in who had a parent with bipolar disorder come into our lab, and usually what we typically do when people come into a psychiatric clinic is we train them about symptoms. So the first couple of slides that I showed you about warning signs, we go through that and we talk about what does depression look like, what does mania look like. We might say, well, tell me what depression looks like for you. What would be the words that you would use? And we just simply do the education. Most people get this, but that's not really a pro-social training, okay? That's just kind of getting yourself acclimated to who you are and how these symptoms express in you. Now add this pro-social training. And these pro-social trainings include communication skills, like things that you think are probably, completely basic and fundamental, right? Like active listening. How can I tell that some of you are listening to me? You're making eye contact, you're nodding your head, you're smiling at me. I know that you're listening, right? I think you're listening. I hope you're listening. There are a lot of things that people do that may make it very clear, nonverbal and verbal, to convey that you're actively listening. But sometimes when we're stressed out, we forget to do that. So reminding ourselves, not just in this space of stress, but also in highly conflictual relationships in the family, can be super helpful to resort back to that particular strength, is to actively listen. To give positive feedback. If you're really hating the family environment, it's really stressful and people aren't getting along at home, imagine how often you're giving positive feedback to each other. Hey Dad, I really appreciated you taking the trash out the other night. It just gave me that extra 5 minutes to do my homework. How often does that happen in a stressful family, right? Not. Or how about a more common and much more precarious problem, and that's how do you make a discussion about making a request for a different behavior because you don't like how somebody is behaving towards you, or giving negative feedback. That's a tough one, and that requires a little bit of training as well. So that's communication skills. Problem-solving skills, everybody walks into my office and says, Mom, Dr. Singh, please solve my problems. I'm like, nope, can't do. You guys are gonna solve your problems. I'm gonna teach you how by doing this collaboratively together. So, if you do the education and then pair it with the pro-social behavior training, it's called family-focused therapy, okay? And we compared this pro-social behavior training, the family-focused therapy, to just simply educating people about symptoms. And what did we find? We found that family-focused therapy delays depression recurrence by 35 more weeks than enhanced care. And look out 4 or 5 years, these kids aren't showing any depression, they're not showing any bipolar symptoms. We've effectively prevented recurrence of symptoms in kids who are already symptomatic. That is hopeful. That's saying that if you just do 12 or 16 weeks of family therapy in a critical sensitive window in a kid's development, it could have reverberating effects on their development later on. So what I'm describing to you, the science behind why these fundamentals are so important, is to reinforce the idea that we can use science to make a very definitive point that this stuff works. And besides which, it's sometimes hard to convince a teenager without the science, and so now you can support it with science, and that can make a big impact. What are the brains doing? We looked at the whole brains of these kids before and after treatment, and we compared them to kids who didn't have a family history of any mood problems. And what we found was a specific area in the prefrontal cortex that really, really was network connected. And it was connected to another part of the brain that was really important for emotion regulation, more so in the kids at risk who have a family history of mood disorders compared to kids who didn't have any of that risk. And what did? We took the kids at risk and we did the family-focused therapy, or we did the enhanced care. And the kids who got the family-focused therapy, their networks strengthened. Treatment strengthened their neural networks. And if you compared them to the healthy control kids, it wasn't that it normalized to what typical kids were doing without any family histories. They had an overconnection. It was almost as if their brain was overly strengthening and shoring up those brain networks to be able to stave away mood symptoms. And we know this to be true because that network that looked like it was strengthening, also the strength of it was correlated with improvement in depression symptoms. So we were able to train the brain, to change the brain, to change the outcome. We have a lot that we can learn from in the past. We can promote and reinforce pro-social behaviors by showing interest, support, appreciation, and love for the people, for what people do to contribute to the well-being of others. Minimize socially and biologically toxic conditions. Don't coerce people. It's a fundamental source of human conflict. Monitor and set limits on influences and opportunities to engage in problem behaviors. So if the screen time is excessive, be present, supervise, set limits and access, but also gradually allowing management of own free time in a safe, fun, and productive way. Promote the mindful, flexible, and pragmatic pursuit of pro-social behaviors. Accept others' emotions and thoughts, and take a detached and playful approach to talking about those thoughts and feelings. Encourage clarity about what we value and what we can do to further our values. A lot of kids, hate the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? I hate that question too. What now I actually engage with kids about is, what problems do you want to solve? And our next generations are very engaged in social justice. They're very motivated in solving the fundamental problems that exist in our society today. It's really important to engage with those values because they're critical for their resilience. And create nurturing environments. Creating those nurturing environments, in fact, may solve many problems in our society. I urge you to read The Nurture Effect by Tony Bigland. He's a prevention scientist in Oregon. And he says that a society in which young people arrive at adulthood with the skills, interests, assets, and health habits needed to live healthy, happy, and productive lives in caring relationships with others. That should be our vision as a society. That's what we need to strive for. To create a roadmap for the future. So, in conclusion, be aware of warning signs and risk factors for mood problems. Evaluate individuals early and over time. It'll increase our understanding of the causes and long-term effects of mood problems. There are certainly effective therapies out there, and they may delay or prevent the onset of mood disorders in individuals at high risk. And practicing and encouraging pro-social behaviors, maintaining consistency in routines, and engaging in physical activity may increase resilience. This is just a brief slide to summarize. We're doing a number of scientific studies at Stanford funded by the National Institute of Health, so tax dollars, and private foundations interested in understanding families affected by mood disorders. We're looking at clinical trials for the safety and benefit of medications to treat mood and anxiety symptoms in kids, and looking at things like struggling to maintain a healthy weight, the effects of these symptoms on the developing brain, and then also looking at the effects of psychotherapies. This is a book that we just recently published. It's targeted more for clinicians and to help them get the skills that they need and the information they need to effectively treat kids. And I just want to acknowledge our village at Stanford, and I'll be happy to take a couple of questions from the audience, and my apologies again for being delayed this evening. Thank you very much for your time.